What if the prison holding you back isn't made of walls, but of regrets you refuse to release? What if the key to your future is hidden in the very mistakes you've been punishing yourself for? Today, you're going to discover how forgiveness, especially forgiving yourself, can unlock the freedom, peace, and success you've been searching for. Acknowledgement is the very foundation of forgiveness, and without it, true healing and transformation cannot begin. The problem many people face is that they live in denial about their mistakes, hoping that if they suppress them long enough, they will fade away. But the truth is, what you bury alive doesn't die. It grows. Regret that is unacknowledged becomes resentment, and guilt that is unaddressed becomes shame that lingers in the shadows of your mind. To forgive yourself, you must first face the reality of what happened. That doesn't mean you have to constantly relive the pain, but it does mean being honest with yourself about your choices, your actions, and the consequences that came from them. Too many people skip this step because they are afraid of the discomfort that comes with honesty. But acknowledgement is not about shaming yourself. It's about liberating yourself. When you shine light on the truth, you take away the power of the darkness that has been keeping you captive. Facing your mistakes head-on is the first step to releasing the burden you have been carrying, because you cannot heal what you pretend doesn't exist. Acknowledgement requires courage because it forces you to confront the person in the mirror without filters or excuses. It is tempting to rationalize our actions, to justify why we made a poor choice, or to blame others for the outcomes we regret. But none of these strategies create freedom. They only create longer chains. True acknowledgement is saying, yes, I did this. Yes, it had consequences. And yes, I am willing to face it now. This moment of honesty breaks the cycle of self-deception that keeps so many people stuck. You see, when you live in denial, you build a wall between yourself and your own growth. You cannot build a future while ignoring the broken pieces of your past. But when you acknowledge your mistakes, you take ownership of your life story. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of your past and start reclaiming your power as the author of your future. Acknowledgement doesn't trap you in regret. It gives you the key to move forward with clarity and purpose. Acknowledgement is also an act of responsibility, and responsibility is the birthplace of freedom. When you accept responsibility for what you've done, you position yourself to also accept the power to change. Without responsibility, you will always look for someone else to blame. And as long as the blame is external, the power to transform is external as well. But when you take full ownership of your actions, you realize that you are not powerless. You are capable of rewriting the narrative. Acknowledgement does not mean self-condemnation. It does not mean labeling yourself as a bad person. It means recognizing that while your past actions may have been flawed, your identity and potential are not defined by them. Responsibility opens the door to transformation because it places the power back in your hands. It says, I can't change what happened, but I can decide what happens next. The reason acknowledgement is the first step is because it brings clarity. Imagine walking into a dark room filled with obstacles. You would stumble, fall, and hurt yourself repeatedly. That is what life feels like when you live in denial of your mistakes. You keep stumbling over the same regrets, repeating the same patterns, and wondering why you can't seem to move forward. But acknowledgement is like turning on the light. Suddenly, you see where the obstacles are, and you can navigate around them. This clarity doesn't erase the pain of the past, but it prevents you from blindly repeating it. Clarity empowers you to learn, to grow, and to step forward with wisdom. Without acknowledgement, the same cycles will continue because you haven't yet admitted to yourself where things went wrong. The greatest freedom comes not from pretending your mistakes didn't happen, but from facing them honestly and using them as stepping stones toward a higher version of yourself. Acknowledgement is also deeply tied to humility. It requires you to lay down your pride, to admit that you don't have it all figured out, and to recognize that you are a work in progress. Many people resist acknowledgement because they confuse mistakes with weakness, but in reality, acknowledgement is a strength. It takes far more courage to say, I was wrong, than to live behind a mask of perfection. Humility doesn't degrade your worth, It elevates it, because it shows that you are mature enough to grow. When you can admit your flaws, you also make room for grace, growth, and wisdom to enter. You allow yourself to be teachable. And being teachable is one of the most powerful qualities of anyone who desires success, peace, or fulfillment. The proud deny, but the humble acknowledge, and in doing so, they rise above the weight of shame. Another layer of acknowledgement is emotional honesty. Sometimes people may admit to what they did, but they disconnect from how it made them feel or how it affected others. Forgiving yourself is not just about acknowledging the facts of what happened. It's also about acknowledging the emotions tied to it. You must allow yourself to feel the regret, the disappointment, or the sorrow, because emotions that are suppressed never disappear. They resurface in unhealthy ways. Emotional acknowledgement means saying, "I feel guilty for this," or "I feel ashamed because of that," without allowing those feelings to define your entire existence. When you give yourself permission to feel, you also give yourself permission to heal. Denial of emotion creates inner conflict, but acknowledgement of emotion creates inner peace. It allows you to process the past rather than being imprisoned by it. In the end, acknowledgement is the gateway to every other step in the process of forgiveness. Until you acknowledge, you cannot separate your identity from your mistakes. Until you acknowledge, you cannot learn the lesson hidden in the pain. Until you acknowledge, you cannot release the weight, replace the condemnation, or take redemptive action. Everything begins here, with a moment of truth, a moment of courage, a moment where you stop running from your reflection and start embracing it with honesty. This step is not easy, but it is necessary, because no matter how much you try to move forward without acknowledgement, your past will always call you back. Once you face it directly, however, you break its power over you and begin walking in the direction of true freedom and forgiveness. One of the greatest obstacles people face when trying to forgive themselves is the tendency to confuse what they did with who they are. A mistake is an event, but identity is the essence of a person, and when the two become entangled, it produces a heavy burden of shame that keeps a person trapped. When someone says, "I failed," that is very different from saying, "I am a failure." The first statement acknowledges an action, while the second statement labels the entire being. This mislabeling is one of the most destructive forces in a person's life because it causes them to carry the weight of a single moment or season of their past as though it were a permanent definition of their worth. The truth is, no matter how big the mistake, no one is ever defined by one choice, one action, or one failure. Life is too dynamic, too fluid, and too filled with opportunities for growth to allow one chapter to dictate the entire book. Forgiving yourself requires the courage to draw a clear line between your identity and your mistakes, recognizing that you are far greater than the worst thing you have ever done. Mistakes are experiences that reveal where growth is needed, not verdicts about your value. Think of a child learning how to walk. They fall over and over, stumbling, bumping their head, or collapsing onto the floor. Yet no one would look at that child and say, "You are a failure at life." Instead, we see the falls as part of the learning process, necessary steps toward eventually standing tall and walking with confidence. As adults, however, we lose that perspective and begin attaching shame to our stumbles. But in reality, the mistakes you've made are proof that you are human, proof that you are in motion, proof that you are growing and attempting to navigate life. To equate your mistakes with your identity is to deny yourself the same grace that you would naturally extend to others. If you wouldn't define someone else by their worst day, why would you define yourself by yours? Separating identity from mistakes means reclaiming your right to evolve, your right to learn, and your right to redefine who you are becoming. The danger of allowing mistakes to define you is that it creates a cycle of self-sabotage. When you internalize the belief that you are your failure, you begin to act in ways that reinforce that belief. This is what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, if you believe you are irresponsible because of one mistake in managing your finances, you may stop trying altogether, convincing yourself that any attempt will end the same way. If you believe you are unworthy because of one broken relationship, you may avoid pursuing new relationships, or worse, enter unhealthy ones that reinforce your false identity. In this way, attaching identity to mistakes creates a downward spiral that becomes difficult to escape. But when you learn to separate your mistakes from your identity, you break that cycle. You begin to see failure not as an identity, but as feedback, not as a permanent condition, but as temporary instruction for your growth. It is also important to understand that mistakes often emerge out of limited knowledge, limited experience, or limited perspective at the time. Looking back, it's easy to judge yourself harshly because you now have more clarity, more maturity, or more wisdom. But at that moment in the past, you were working with the tools you had. And even if those tools were inadequate, that does not mean you, as a person, are inadequate. Separating your identity from your mistakes means giving yourself the same compassion you would extend to a friend who did the best they could with what they knew then. You would not condemn them forever. You would remind them that they can grow, improve, and learn. That same grace must be given inwardly. Forgiveness of self begins when you stop holding your past self hostage to the standards and knowledge of your present self. Another layer of separating identity from mistakes comes from recognizing the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt can be healthy when it leads you to acknowledge wrongdoing and make amends. Shame, however, is destructive because it convinces you that no amount of effort or change can ever redeem you. The danger is that shame creates paralysis. It whispers that there is no point in trying because who you are is permanently broken. To forgive yourself, you must learn to transform shame into constructive guilt, acknowledging the action while preserving the worth of the individual. When you say, I made a mistake, but I am not a mistake, you disarm the destructive voice of shame and reclaim the dignity of your identity. Your identity is rooted not in your failures, but in your capacity to rise from them. Every human being has an inner reservoir of strength, creativity, resilience, and potential that cannot be erased by one wrong turn. Think of the most successful people in history: leaders, inventors, entrepreneurs, thinkers. Every one of them failed at some point, often publicly, sometimes disastrously. Yet their identities were not destroyed by those moments. Why? Because they understood that mistakes are experiences, not definitions. Thomas Edison once said that he didn't fail 1,000 times when trying to invent the light bulb. He simply found 1,000 ways that didn't work. His mistakes were lessons, not labels. In the same way, you must learn to treat your missteps not as evidence of who you are, but as instructions guiding you to a higher version of yourself. Separating identity from mistakes also requires reframing the narrative you tell yourself. If your inner dialogue constantly repeats, I always mess things up, you will live under the weight of that story. But if you reframe the story to say, I made a mistake, but I learned something valuable, you change the entire trajectory of your mindset. Words shape identity, and identity shapes behavior. Forgiveness begins with changing the story you tell about yourself. Instead of labeling yourself by the past, you must learn to label yourself by the possibilities of the future. You are not the sum total of your mistakes. You are the sum total of your potential. You are not defined by your failures. You are defined by your ability to rise, to grow, and to keep moving forward despite them. Finally, it is worth remembering that every person you admire, every role model you respect, every mentor or leader who has ever inspired you has also made mistakes. The difference is not that they lived perfect lives, but that they refused to allow their mistakes to define who they were. They separated the two and continued on their journey, growing wiser, stronger, and more impactful. When you separate your identity from your mistakes, you step into the same path of growth. You give yourself permission to keep moving, to keep striving, and to keep evolving into the person you were meant to be, regardless of the chapters in your past that you might wish you could rewrite. One of the most damaging habits people fall into after making mistakes is sentencing themselves to a lifetime of guilt and regret, as if paying for the past over and over somehow redeems it. They replay the same moments in their mind, punishing themselves for choices they can't undo, words they can't retract, or opportunities they can't reclaim. The problem with this mindset is that it doesn't lead to growth. It only leads to stagnation. When you keep yourself locked inside the prison of self-condemnation, you are essentially serving a sentence for a crime you've already acknowledged. Forgiveness requires you to shift that perspective by realizing that the purpose of a mistake is not to keep you imprisoned, but to teach you something valuable. Every failure contains within it a lesson, and once that lesson is learned, the punishment must end. To learn the lesson without repeating the sentence is to release yourself into freedom, taking what the experience taught you while refusing to let it dominate your identity or your future. Mistakes are some of life's most powerful teachers. They often reveal things that success cannot show you. Success can breed complacency, but failure forces reflection. When you fall short, you're confronted with what you didn't see before, blind spots in your perspective, gaps in your knowledge, or weaknesses in your habits. These lessons, if you embrace them, can become stepping stones to greater wisdom and strength. But the tragedy is that many people are so consumed by the shame of making a mistake that they miss the lesson entirely. Instead of asking, "What can this teach me?" they ask, "What does this say about me?" The first question leads to growth. The second leads to despair. When you shift from self-judgment to self-inquiry, you discover that every failure has the potential to become a seed for success. Forgiveness begins not when you erase the past, but when you mine it for wisdom and use that wisdom to build a better future. Learning the lesson means taking the time to reflect deeply on what happened and why it happened. This is not the same as endlessly dwelling on regret. Dwelling is passive. It keeps you stuck in replay mode without resolution. Reflection, however, is active. It allows you to examine your actions with honesty and curiosity, not condemnation. Reflection asks, what choice did I make that led to this outcome? What pattern of thinking influenced me? What warning signs did I ignore? What could I have done differently? These questions don't weaken you. They empower you because they provide clarity and prepare you to avoid the same missteps in the future. It is like touching a hot stove. If you don't reflect on the pain, you may do it again. But once you understand the cause and effect, you know not to repeat it. The lesson becomes ingrained, guiding your decisions without the need to keep reliving the punishment. Another important part of learning the lesson is realizing that pain without purpose is wasted, but pain with purpose becomes power. If you go through a failure and simply punish yourself, all you have is wasted energy. But if you take that same failure and extract the meaning, you transform it into wisdom that can fuel your future. For example, someone who mishandles money and ends up in debt can either live under the sentence of shame for years, or they can take the lesson and become disciplined, intentional, and knowledgeable about finances. That same person could even go on to teach others how to avoid the same mistakes. In that way, the failure becomes a foundation for a greater future. The difference is not in the mistake itself. It is in whether the person chooses to keep punishing themselves or chooses to learn from the lesson and move forward. Repeating the sentence keeps you chained to the past, but learning the lesson frees you to create a new chapter. Imagine carrying a heavy weight on your back everywhere you go, constantly reminded of a mistake you made years ago. Every step feels harder, every opportunity feels further away, and every dream feels less achievable. That's what happens when you keep sentencing yourself. You carry unnecessary weight that slows down your progress. But when you say, "I've already learned from this, and I refuse to keep reliving it," you drop the burden and suddenly have the strength to move faster and further. Forgiveness is not about denying the mistake. It's about refusing to let it dominate your present and your future once its purpose has been served. The sentence is not meant to be a life sentence. It is meant to be a temporary correction that teaches you something valuable. Part of not repeating the sentence also involves guarding your thoughts and words. The way you talk about your mistakes determines whether you stay imprisoned by them. If you constantly tell yourself, "I'll never get it right," or "this always happens to me," you reinforce the punishment. But if you say, "That was a tough lesson, but I'm grateful I learned it," you shift the narrative from defeat to growth. The brain responds to repetition, and the more you reinforce the idea that you're condemned, the more you live as though you are. Conversely, the more you reinforce the lesson learned, the more you build resilience and confidence. The words you speak to yourself are like keys. They can either keep you locked in the cell of guilt or unlock the door to freedom. It is also important to acknowledge that learning the lesson is not just for you. It often has ripple effects on others. When you learn from your mistakes and refuse to live under constant self-condemnation, you model to others that growth is possible. You become a living example of resilience and redemption. Parents who acknowledge their past mistakes but use them to teach their children create generational wisdom. Leaders who admit where they went wrong but share the lessons openly build trust and inspire those they lead. Even in friendships and relationships, being honest about what you've learned shows others that mistakes do not disqualify someone from growth. They qualify them to become wiser, more compassionate, and more intentional. The lesson is not wasted when it becomes part of your story of transformation. Ultimately, the essence of this principle is that life is too valuable to waste it replaying the same mistakes like an endless punishment. Mistakes are part of being human, but they are not meant to define the whole of your existence. They are meant to teach, to refine, to direct, and to prepare you for what lies ahead. Once you have learned the lesson, the sentence has already been served. The challenge is whether you will keep punishing yourself long after the correction has done its work, or whether you will release yourself into the freedom of growth and continue building the future that is waiting for you. Carrying guilt, regret, and shame is like dragging a heavy load everywhere you go. It slows you down, it drains your energy, and it makes even the simplest steps forward feel like a struggle. Many people do not realize how much invisible weight they are carrying every single day because they have gotten used to it. They wake up already tired, they move through their days with a constant heaviness, and they wonder why life feels like a never-ending uphill climb. The truth is, much of that exhaustion doesn't come from what's happening around them, but from what's happening within them. The unspoken guilt, the unresolved regret, and the harsh way they talk to themselves have created a weight on their soul. Forgiving yourself requires learning how to release this weight, and the key to doing that is self-compassion. Self-compassion is not about making excuses or avoiding responsibility. It is about treating yourself with the same kindness and grace you would extend to someone you love who is struggling. The problem is that most people are far more compassionate toward others than they are toward themselves. If a close friend came to you and said, "I made a mistake, and I feel terrible about it," you wouldn't respond by saying, "You're worthless, you'll never get it right, and you should be ashamed forever." No, you would probably encourage them, remind them that they are human, and help them see a way forward. Yet when it comes to yourself, the inner voice is often cruel, relentless, and unforgiving. That inner critic magnifies every flaw, replays every mistake, and whispers that you don't deserve peace. This is why self-compassion is so vital, because the voice you listen to most often is your own. If your self-talk is toxic, it poisons your ability to heal. But if your self-talk is compassionate, it becomes a source of strength. Releasing the weight begins when you change the way you speak to yourself, choosing words of understanding instead of condemnation. Self-compassion is powerful because it gives you permission to be human. Perfection is an illusion, yet so many people demand it of themselves. They believe that unless they perform flawlessly, they are unworthy of love or forgiveness. This standard is not only impossible, but also destructive, because it sets you up to fail before you even begin. Self-compassion acknowledges that being human means you will make mistakes, but it also affirms that making mistakes does not disqualify you from worthiness. In fact, it is often through mistakes that your greatest growth takes place. Compassion says, "Yes, I fell short, but that doesn't mean I'm unworthy. Yes, I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I'm beyond redemption." When you release yourself from the impossible standard of perfection, you free yourself from the crushing weight of shame. Releasing the weight through self-compassion also means reframing how you view the role of mistakes in your life. Instead of seeing them as proof that you are broken, you can see them as opportunities to learn, to evolve, and to deepen your understanding of yourself and others. A compassionate perspective doesn't ignore the pain of a mistake, but it uses that pain constructively. For example, if you regret how you handled a relationship, compassion doesn't say, "Forget it and move on," in a dismissive way. Instead, it says, I acknowledge the pain this caused, but I will use that awareness to grow in how I handle relationships moving forward. This shift transforms mistakes from dead weight into stepping stones. The compassion you extend toward yourself becomes fuel that propels you forward instead of a chain that holds you back. Another dimension of self-compassion is giving yourself the same patience you extend to others. Growth is not instant, and healing is not linear. Too often, people become frustrated with themselves for not getting over something quickly enough, as though healing should be immediate. But real growth takes time, and just because you're still processing doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. Compassion gives you space to take that time without judgment. It allows you to see progress in small steps, rather than condemning yourself for not being perfect. Think of how you would treat a child learning something new. You wouldn't expect them to master it on the first try. You would encourage them, celebrate their progress, and reassure them when they stumble. That same attitude is what you must adopt toward yourself if you want to release the weight of shame and guilt. Self-compassion also involves creating a new internal narrative about who you are. Many people live under the burden of labels they've placed on themselves. I'm a failure, I'm irresponsible, I'm unworthy. These labels become like heavy stones added to the backpack of guilt they already carry. Compassion replaces those destructive labels with truth. It says, I am learning, I am growing, I am worthy of love and forgiveness. This shift in language is not empty self-talk. It is a deliberate act of reclaiming your identity from the grip of shame. When you consistently affirm yourself with compassion, you gradually lighten the load you've been carrying. Each compassionate thought removes a stone from the backpack, making the journey of life less burdensome and more freeing. Releasing the weight through self-compassion also has a profound effect on your relationships with others. When you are harsh and unforgiving toward yourself, you often project that same harshness onto those around you. But when you learn to treat yourself with kindness, you naturally extend more kindness to others. Compassion becomes a way of being, not just toward yourself, but toward everyone you encounter. This creates healthier relationships, stronger connections, and a more peaceful way of living. Instead of being weighed down by resentment or guilt, you carry a spirit of grace that uplifts both you and those around you. At its core, self-compassion is about recognizing that you are worthy of love, forgiveness, and peace, even in the aftermath of mistakes. It is about refusing to let guilt and shame define your life, and instead choosing to walk in freedom. Carrying regret is like dragging around chains that were never meant to be permanent. Forgiving yourself and releasing that weight means acknowledging your humanity, embracing your growth, and speaking to yourself with the same kindness you would give to someone you care about deeply. When you practice self-compassion, you lighten the load you carry, making space for joy, creativity, and hope to enter your life once again. Condemnation is one of the most destructive forces in a person's inner life because it keeps the mind chained to guilt and shame. It is the voice that constantly reminds you of what you did wrong, replaying failures and magnifying regrets until they drown out every spark of hope. Condemnation is relentless, whispering that you are unworthy of forgiveness, that you are broken beyond repair, that you should never expect peace or joy again. Left unchecked, this voice becomes the soundtrack of your mind. And because your thoughts shape your beliefs, and your beliefs shape your actions, condemnation keeps you living as though you are still defined by your worst mistakes. The antidote to this cycle is affirmation. Affirmation is the intentional choice to speak words of life, growth, and possibility over yourself, words that align with your potential rather than your past. To forgive yourself, you must learn to silence condemnation by replacing it with affirmations that build, strengthen, and liberate your soul. Affirmations are powerful because they reprogram the subconscious mind. Your brain does not distinguish much between what is vividly imagined and what is real. It responds to repetition. If you continually tell yourself, I am a failure, your brain accepts that as fact and begins filtering your experiences through that belief. You will then unconsciously seek out situations that confirm your self-condemning narrative. But if you tell yourself, I am learning, I am capable, I am growing, your brain accepts that too, and you begin living in alignment with those words. Over time, your internal dialogue becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, either destructive through condemnation or constructive through affirmation. The key is that you get to decide which words dominate your inner world. By consciously choosing affirmations that uplift and empower you, you begin to dismantle the toxic structures of condemnation that have been weighing you down. Replacing condemnation with affirmation does not mean denying reality or pretending mistakes never happened. It is not about avoiding accountability, but about shifting focus. Condemnation says, "This is who you are because of what you did." Affirmation says, "This is what I've learned, and this is who I am becoming." The difference is perspective. One keeps you trapped in the past, while the other opens the door to the future. When you choose affirmation, you acknowledge the reality of your past without allowing it to control the narrative of your present. For example, instead of saying, "I ruined everything," you can affirm, "I am using this experience to become wiser and stronger." Instead of saying, "I can't do anything right," you affirm, "I am capable of growing and I improve every day." The mistake remains acknowledged, but its power is stripped away because the narrative has been reframed with affirmations rooted in hope and possibility. The practice of affirmation is not a one-time event, but a daily discipline. Condemnation is often deeply ingrained, built over years of self-criticism, cultural messages, or voices from the past that told you that you would never be enough. To counteract years of negative programming, you must consistently feed your mind with affirmations that create a new story. This might mean writing affirmations on sticky notes and placing them where you will see them every day, repeating them aloud in the morning as part of your routine, or journaling them until they become second nature. The repetition matters because the subconscious mind is shaped through consistency. Just as condemnation was built word by word, affirmation must also be built word by word until it becomes the dominant voice inside you. Affirmation also works best when it is specific and personal. Generic positivity can feel hollow, but targeted affirmations that speak directly to your struggles can penetrate deeply. If you struggle with guilt, affirmations like, "I am worthy of forgiveness and I choose to forgive myself," can become anchors of healing. If you struggle with self-doubt, affirmations like, "I am capable and I am equipped to handle what comes my way," can replace fear with confidence. If you struggle with regret, affirmations like, "My past does not define me, I am defined by my potential," can shift the weight from what was to what can be. These tailored affirmations act like medicine, treating the specific wounds caused by condemnation with intentional words of truth and renewal. It is also important to recognize that affirmations are not empty self-talk, but alignments with deeper truths about your humanity and potential. Condemnation often distorts reality by exaggerating failures and minimizing worth, but affirmation restores balance by reminding you that your identity is not erased by your mistakes. When you say, "I am worthy of love and growth," you are not inventing something false. You are declaring a truth that condemnation has tried to bury. Affirmation becomes a way of reclaiming the truth about who you are at your core, a human being capable of learning, growing, and creating change. Forgiveness requires this reclamation because without it, condemnation will continue to distort how you see yourself and limit how you live. Replacing condemnation with affirmation also impacts how you interact with the world around you. When you are filled with self-condemnation, you carry insecurity into your relationships, often projecting your inner criticism outward. You may withdraw, lash out, or struggle to trust because deep down you believe you are unworthy. But when affirmation takes root, you approach others from a place of wholeness and confidence. You become more compassionate, more generous, and more open because you are no longer weighed down by the lie that you are broken beyond repair. Affirmation frees you to show up fully, to connect deeply, and to pursue opportunities boldly because you are no longer living under the shadow of condemnation. Another aspect of this practice is that affirmation is proactive, while condemnation is reactive. Condemnation waits until you fail to remind you of your flaws, but affirmation can prepare you before challenges arise. By affirming yourself daily, you build resilience that equips you to face setbacks without collapsing under guilt. When a mistake happens, instead of immediately spiraling into condemnation, your mind will be trained to respond with affirmation. This is a lesson, not a label. I am still growing. I will rise again. That shift in response is the difference between being crushed by failure and being propelled by it. Affirmation builds a safety net that allows you to take risks, knowing that even if you fall, your worth remains intact. Ultimately, replacing condemnation with affirmation is about creating an inner environment where forgiveness can flourish. Condemnation suffocates forgiveness, keeping it from taking root. Affirmation nourishes forgiveness, giving it room to grow. By consistently affirming who you are becoming rather than condemning who you were, you create space for healing, growth, and freedom. The words you speak to yourself become the atmosphere of your life, and when that atmosphere is filled with affirmation, you find yourself able to move forward with clarity, courage, and renewed strength. When it comes to forgiving yourself, there is a crucial step that goes beyond thought and beyond emotion. It is the step of action. Reflection, acknowledgement, and affirmations are powerful, but they remain incomplete if they are not followed by tangible steps that redeem the lessons of your past and channel them into something constructive. Taking redemptive action is about turning regret into responsibility, guilt into growth, and pain into purpose. It means refusing to let your mistakes be wasted by allowing them to simply haunt you, and instead using them as raw material to build something greater. Too often people remain stuck in a cycle of endless self-analysis without ever moving into action. They think about what they should have done, replay what they regret, and speak affirmations over themselves, yet they fail to take any concrete step to redirect their life. True forgiveness cannot remain in theory. It must manifest in how you live, how you treat others, and how you use your past as a tool for contribution. Redemptive action is powerful because it transforms your story. A mistake on its own can feel meaningless, but when you use it to create something better, it becomes part of a larger narrative of redemption. For example, someone who once struggled with poor choices in relationships can use that pain to mentor others who are walking down the same destructive path. Someone who mismanaged money and paid the price can later teach financial wisdom to those who lack guidance. Someone who battled addiction can use their journey of recovery to inspire hope in those still struggling. What once seemed like a permanent stain on your life can become a beacon of light for others when you turn it outward in service. This is the essence of redemption, not erasing the past, but transforming it into a source of strength and direction. Forgiveness deepens when you realize that your story can be a tool for healing, not only for yourself, but for others as well. Redemptive action also means making amends wherever possible. There are some situations in life where the harm you caused can never be fully undone, but in many cases, you have the opportunity to right a wrong or bring restoration. This might mean apologizing sincerely to someone you hurt, offering to repair damage you caused, or even quietly changing your behavior to demonstrate growth. An apology alone may not erase the past, but the act of extending it releases both you and the other person from some of the weight of unresolved pain. Even if the other person does not accept it, your willingness to take responsibility and act shows that you are no longer running from your past, but are committed to building something better. Forgiveness of yourself becomes more complete when you actively participate in repairing what you can, because it transforms passive regret into active restoration. Another element of redemptive action is intentional growth. It is not enough to simply regret what you did. You must also commit to becoming someone who rises above it. This means seeking out knowledge, practicing discipline, and putting new systems in place to avoid repeating the same mistake. For example, if you mishandled opportunities in the past because of procrastination, redemptive action would mean building habits of time management and accountability. If you harmed relationships because of poor communication, it would mean practicing empathy, patience, and learning better conflict resolution skills. Taking redemptive action requires humility because it demands that you admit where you need to grow and then intentionally pursue that growth. But it also builds confidence because every step forward proves to yourself that you are not trapped by your past. You are actively building a new future. Redemptive action often requires consistency rather than grand gestures. Many people believe they need to make one dramatic act to prove they've changed, but true redemption is seen in the daily choices you make. It is in showing up consistently, in keeping your word, in honoring commitments, and in living with integrity. Over time, these consistent actions rebuild trust with others and with yourself. The more you see yourself acting in alignment with your values, the easier it becomes to forgive yourself, because your present behavior starts to outweigh the memory of past mistakes. Each consistent step adds weight to the truth that you are not defined by what you did then. You are defined by what you are choosing to do now. Forgiveness takes root when your actions affirm your growth. Taking redemptive action also requires courage, because it often means stepping into areas where fear and shame have been holding you back. There may be environments you've avoided, people you've distanced yourself from, or dreams you've abandoned because they remind you of past failures. Redemptive action means facing those places again, not to repeat the past, but to reclaim them in strength. If you once failed in business, redemption might mean trying again with new wisdom. If you once abandoned a dream, redemption might mean picking it back up with renewed commitment. Courage allows you to confront the very places that used to symbolize regret and turn them into platforms for resilience. Every time you step back into a place you once ran from, you diminish the power of shame and expand the power of forgiveness. One of the most transformative aspects of redemptive action is contribution. When you take what you've been through and use it to serve others, your pain finds purpose. Contribution does not always have to be on a grand scale. Sometimes it is as simple as sharing your story with someone who is struggling, offering a helping hand where you once needed one, or creating something that inspires others. Contribution is redemption in motion because it shifts the focus from what you lost to what you can give. It reminds you that even in your lowest moments, there is something valuable that can emerge. This mindset not only helps others, but also reinforces your own healing, because every act of service becomes a reminder that your story has meaning beyond your mistakes. Redemptive action is the bridge between regret and renewal. Without it, you may understand forgiveness in your mind, but never fully experience it in your life. It turns theory into reality, regret into growth, and guilt into guidance. It is the process of taking responsibility, seeking growth, and creating new patterns that demonstrate you are no longer bound to your past. It is the evidence that forgiveness has taken root, not only in your emotions, but in your choices, your habits, and your contributions to the world around you. Through redemptive action, you prove to yourself that your mistakes were not wasted. They were transformed into lessons that now empower you to walk forward with clarity, strength, and purpose. Forgiving yourself is not a single decision that erases every trace of guilt or regret forever. It is a practice that must be renewed each day. The mind has a tendency to replay the past like an old recording, and just when you think you have finally moved forward, a memory, a word, or a familiar place can trigger the weight of condemnation again. This is why choosing daily release is essential. Forgiveness is not simply an event, but an ongoing discipline, a continual letting go of the burdens that try to reattach themselves. Just as the body requires daily nourishment and care to remain strong, the heart and mind require daily release to remain free from the grip of guilt and shame. It is not weakness to feel the need to forgive yourself again and again. It is simply the recognition that healing is a process, not a moment. By committing to daily release, you build an inner rhythm of renewal that keeps you walking lightly rather than being dragged by the chains of the past. Daily release begins with awareness. Each morning when you wake up, you have the choice of what kind of story you will carry into the day. Will you allow your thoughts to dwell on your mistakes, keeping you bound to yesterday's failures? Or will you consciously choose to set them down and step into today with a lighter heart? Awareness is the first checkpoint because many people live their lives on autopilot, unaware of how much energy they are expending carrying guilt that could have been released. To choose daily release, you must pause long enough to examine your thoughts and feelings, notice when condemnation is creeping in, and deliberately shift your focus back to forgiveness. This intentional awareness transforms your mornings from a place of heaviness to a place of opportunity because you are no longer reacting to guilt. You are proactively letting it go. One way to practice daily release is through rituals that anchor your decision. Some people find release through prayer, surrendering their regrets to a higher power and choosing to walk forward in peace. Others find release through meditation, visualizing themselves unclenching their fists and letting go of the burdens they have been holding. Journaling is another powerful tool because writing down what you are choosing to release not only externalizes it, but also prevents it from swirling endlessly in your thoughts. You might write, "Today I release the guilt of disappointing someone," or "Today I release the regret of yesterday's choices." Once written, those words act as a declaration, a reminder that the decision has been made. Rituals like these help daily release become more than an idea. They make it tangible, physical, and unforgettable. Daily release is also a matter of perspective. When you choose release, you are declaring that the past has no authority over the present. It does not mean that the consequences of your actions disappear, but it does mean that your identity is no longer tied to them. Every time you let go, you are affirming that your value is not in what you did, but in who you are becoming. This perspective shift is crucial because the enemy of forgiveness is often perfectionism. Many people believe they must reach a flawless standard before they can truly forgive themselves, but daily release recognizes that growth is incremental. You do not need to be perfect to deserve release. You simply need to choose it again and again until it becomes the natural posture of your life. Another element of daily release is learning to replace old patterns of self-talk with compassionate ones. Each day brings moments where the voice of condemnation might say, "You'll never change," or "You're still the same failure you were before." In those moments, choosing release means speaking back to that voice with words of truth and affirmation. "I am growing. I am not who I was yesterday. I choose freedom over shame." These responses may feel forced at first, but with practice, they become second nature. By consistently replacing self-condemnation with compassionate affirmations, you reinforce the act of release and train your mind to default toward grace rather than guilt. Over time, the harsh voice of the past grows weaker, and the nurturing voice of forgiveness grows stronger. Daily release also requires patience with yourself. Some days the weight may feel heavier than others, and you may find it difficult to let go fully. In those moments, release is less about achieving complete emotional relief and more about simply choosing not to carry the burden as tightly. Even if the feelings linger, the decision to release still matters because it sets the tone for how you will act and respond. Forgiveness is not about erasing every feeling of regret instantly. It is about refusing to let those feelings control your direction. By choosing release even when it feels imperfect, you build resilience and teach yourself that you are capable of moving forward, even with unresolved emotions. Daily release is also an act of freedom that extends beyond you. When you choose to let go of guilt and shame, you create more space in your heart for love, creativity, and connection. Unforgiveness consumes mental and emotional energy that could be used for building relationships, pursuing dreams, and contributing to the world. Every day that you choose release, you reclaim that energy and redirect it toward life-giving pursuits. This shift not only benefits you, but also those around you, because people who live in forgiveness radiate peace and authenticity. Instead of being preoccupied with their own regrets, they are present, attentive, and generous. Choosing release daily means you are choosing to show up for your life fully without being distracted by the chains of the past. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of daily release is that it builds momentum. At first, letting go may feel difficult, almost like lifting a heavy weight. But the more consistently you practice, the lighter it becomes. Over time, you develop a habit of forgiveness that is as natural as breathing. You no longer wait for guilt to subside on its own. You actively release it before it has a chance to take root. This momentum allows you to live with increasing freedom because the past has less and less influence over your present. It does not mean you forget what happened, but it does mean that your memories lose their power to dominate you. They become lessons, not prisons, and you learn to walk with strength, unburdened by the constant replay of what once was. In the end, choosing daily release is about giving yourself the grace to be human, to make mistakes, to learn, and to keep going without being defined by yesterday's missteps. It is the discipline of waking up each day and deciding, I will not carry what no longer serves me. I will not allow yesterday to dictate today. It is about choosing freedom over bondage, compassion over condemnation, and growth over guilt. And when practiced consistently, it becomes one of the most liberating habits you can ever develop because it allows you to live each day with clarity, lightness, and renewed purpose.